This LOS is define a parameter, a sample statistic, and a frequency distribution. The first part of this LOS is describe a parameter. So just as a quick review, we're going to look at the populations and samples again. So descriptive statistics is the study of how data can be summarized effectively to describe the important aspects of large data sets. Statistical inference involves making forecasts, estimates, or judgments about a larger group from the smaller group actually observed. A population is defined as all members of a specified group. And now, any descriptive measure of a population characteristic is called a parameter. Although a population can have many parameters, investment analysts are usually concerned with only a few, such as the mean value, the range of investment returns, and the variance. A sample is a subset of a population, and a sample statistic or statistic is a quantity computed from or used to describe a sample. Now we're going to look at a frequency distribution, and it's a tabular display of data summarized into a relatively small number of intervals. So here's the steps on the construction of a frequency distribution. 1, sort the data in ascending order. 2, calculate the range of the data, and the range is defined as the maximum value minus the minimum value. Decide on the number of intervals in the frequency distribution, which is k. Determine the interval width as the range, divided by k. Determine the intervals by successively adding the interval width to the minimum value to determine the ending points of intervals, stopping after reaching an interval that includes the maximum value. Count the number of observations falling in each interval, the absolute frequency, and then construct a table of the intervals listed from smallest to largest that shows the number of observations falling in each interval. Now that sounds a little bit confusing, but I think if we just use a simple example, looking at stock returns, annual returns on investments, the S&P 500, you'll understand very quickly what a frequency distribution and how easy it is to construct a frequency distribution. This is another example of an LOS that we learn in quant that it gets applied later on in another section. In this case, it's portfolio management. So in that case, we're going to look at the annual returns to the stock market, the S&P 500. And that's easy. The annual returns is the ending price level of the S&P 500 minus the beginning price level, January the 1st, plus any dividends received divided by the beginning price level. Then we're going to get a range of data returns, the maximum value minus the minimum value. And if we look at that data from 1926, whatever they're using, to 2012, 13, 14, 1931 had the worst return, annual return. 1954 had the best. So that gives us our range. Then we decide on the number of intervals in the frequency distribution. There's 11 using Ibbotson data, and I'll talk about the Ibbotson data later. And then we determine the interval width, and this is pretty easy. It's typically 10%. So we have interval widths of annual returns from 0% to 10%, from 10 to 20, from 20 to 30. And then on the negative side, from 0 to negative 10%, from negative 10% to negative 20, from negative 20% to negative 30. Then you're just going to sort the data and count the number of observations that fall into each interval. So for example, there's 3 years where the return fell into the range of negative 20% to negative 30%, and there was 3 in the year, 3 years falling into the range of plus 40% to plus 50%, for example. And then the table can be converted into a graph, and we call that a histogram. The CFA Institute uses 2 sources for return data. One of them, which is very famous, is the Ibbotson SBBI yearbook, and it's now being published by Wiley. And I just want to show you, this is a screenshot of my computer from the internet. You just Google search SBBI yearbook Ibbotson, and it'll bring it up. And this is sort of the definitive study that has historical returns. So just a quick description on the Ibbotson SBBI yearbook. You can see that they have the comprehensive records dating back to 1926. It covers common stocks, long-term government bonds, long-term corporate bonds, treasury bills, and the consumer price index. So it's the data in this book is used for various charts, histograms, etc. throughout the CFA Institute curriculum. Another good source for historical returns is by the Professor Damodaran at New York University, Stern School of Business. And you can see that he has on his website, which is publicly available, the annual returns on investments starting from 1928 for the S&P 500, for the 3-month T-bill, for a 10-year T-bond, and then of course he has the compounded value of $100. And it also gives you information on his methodology for calculating the S&P 500, the 3-month T-bill, and the 10-year T-bond. Okay, calculating the annual returns on bonds is a little bit more difficult than calculating the returns on the S&P 500, which is fairly easy. Okay, so he's got a right here. He's got a Excel spreadsheet where you can download this data and have a look at it, and it's a very useful website. I just wanted to show you very quickly how easy it is to do some of these calculations. So here I've downloaded the Damodaran Excel spreadsheet. So if we look just here very quickly, the 1928 year, we have an S&P return of 43.81. So at the bottom, when you download a sheet, you've got the returns by the year, then you've got the raw data. So if we just click over to the raw data, I've highlighted here, how did we get that return? Well, it's the ending price level of the S&P 500 plus the dividends divided by the beginning price level. So if I just bring up my calculator, 24.35 plus 1.05, that's going to be our ending price level plus the dividend. If we divide by 17.66 and then minus 1, 43.8279, and if we go 43.81, so some very small rounding. But it's as easy as that, folks. We just take the ending price level of the S&P 500 plus the dividends divided by the beginning price level of the S&P 500. And it's done for every year, and then you get your returns by year. And then you can, with those returns, you can sort them from lowest to highest, and then break it up into ranges of 0 to 10% positive return, 0 to negative 10% return, and then just count the number of years that fall into those ranges, and then you can create your table with the data and then the histogram. And then just very quickly on the dividend yield, that's just the 1.05 divided by 24.35. Just bring up the calculator quickly on that. 1.05, and that would be an average of the company's dividends that were paid. 1.05 divided by 24.35, and yes, you've got a 0.431, some small rounding, is the dividend yield. Okay, so this is just my little quick example. I shortened the data from 1970 to 2013. So it's just using that Damodaran data. I just take the data and then I sort it from lowest returns to highest returns. And then the first thing that I can do is I can do a chart of the annual percentage change in the index. Okay, so we can see that from 1970 to 2013, negative annual returns occur approximately 1/3 of the time. And if we go for longer sample sizes, this is typically the case that approximately 1/3 of the time, we've got some negative annual returns to the S&P 500. Okay, so this is very easy to do. This is just taking that annual return data and plotting as a line graph. Okay, I just want to show you I took the data from Damodaran's, and then for that line graph, I just simply cut out the returns from 1970, and then I just created a quick line graph, and it's as easy as that. And then the next thing I did is you just sort the data, and we're going to sort it from the returns from lowest to highest. Okay, so we sort by the S&P 500 from smallest to largest, hit OK. And we can see 2008, for that time period, had the lowest return. Then we can create our ranges, 0 to 10%, positive, 0 to negative 10%, and then we just we count the number of observations that fall within each of our ranges. From that, we then create the graph, which is the histogram. So just a quick look back at our chart again. So you can see here was our 2008, and from that data that we downloaded into Excel, it's really easy to understand that was a negative 36.55% return for that year, and that's a calendar year. So that starts at January the 1st and goes to December the 31st. We know that the decline from peak to trough was more than that, but we're looking at, in this case, the data is always being presented in calendar years. So after sorting the data and creating some ranges, as I said, so here's the number of returns. So it's from 1970 to 2013. You can see we had 8 years where the annual return fell between 0 to 10%. And we had 12 years where the annual return fell between 10 to 20%. And you can see that is the most very frequent returns. And in fact, we had 9 years where the returns fell between 20 and 30%. Okay? So again, going back, here was our 2008. We had, recall, it was negative 36.55%. We just had one observation, 1 year, that fell into that range from negative 30% to negative 40. Here we had 2 years. One of those years was 1974. There was a negative return of 25.9%. And that's how we take some return data, in summary, the S&P 500 in this case, and we can calculate, one, the annual returns, ending price level minus beginning, plus the dividend, divided by the beginning. Then two, we could do a line graph of the annual returns if we want. But then three, we sort the data from smallest to largest. Then we create our intervals, 10 to 20%. You know, in this case, we're using 10%. And then we finally count the number of years that are falling into each. And then we do a chart again, and that's what we call a histogram. It's as easy as that. Okay, the last few slides were a little bit nice to know, not really need to know, but sometimes, as I said, to consolidate your understanding of the curriculum, it's good to go outside the textbook and say, hey, where is that coming from? And is there other stuff that's out there that I could understand or use? And in some cases, that's very helpful, and that's just what I tried to do. So this is the actual histogram from the CFA Level 1 curriculum. And you can see the source, of course, is the Ibbotson SBBI yearbook. So I showed you where you find that. And you can also see here's our 2008. We had the negative 36.55% return. And then the other interesting thing to see is what we have the range here from plus 10 to 20%. And that's the most, that has the most number of years. So the most frequent return from 1926 to 2008 on an annual basis was between 10 to 20%. And that's probably why when you talk about people's expectations for stock returns, they'll say, yeah, I kind of expect to get 10%, because that's been the most frequent return historically, the return range. And just a quick thing here, we call that the modal interval. That's the range where we've had the most observations. We call that the modal range. So you can see the frequency range was 10%, the frequency range, and the range went from negative 50% to plus 60%. So on my language, I should be a little bit more clear. When I'm talking about the 10 to 20, we're talking about the frequency range. The entire range is the maximum minus the minimum, okay? Okay, this is the last slide for this LOS, and it's just a little bit of fun. It's not included in the CFA curriculum, but it's just something that I came across once, and it's credited to UBS. And they had a histogram with annual United States stock market returns. So it was never clear, how they're going back to 1825, what the index was. I know for the Ibbotson and the Damodar, we're always talking about the S&P 500, the S&P 500. Anyhow, this goes right back to 1825. And you can see the thing that I wanted to point out, the positive years was 130, the negative years was 55. So my sample size from 1970 to 2013 was about the same. Remember, we said that negative returns from here over are happening about a third of the time. So when you invest in stocks, you really have the expectation that 1 out of 3 years on a calendar basis, I'm going to have less money in my account than at the beginning of the year potentially, because a third of the time we're going to have negative annual returns. And there's our 2008, which I just highlighted again, was a very bad year. It's falling between the range of negative 30 to 40. And then, of course, this is the other thing that I just want to point out. If you go back, this is a larger sample size, and in this larger sample size, the most frequent return was falling between the 0 to 10%. So again, that's why I said most people, when they have an expectation of stock prices, again, it's usually, you often hear, 10%, or sometimes you hear 8 to 10%, because historically, that's been the most frequent frequency range. Okay, that's it for this LOS. Thank you.